Thanks very much. Chris, I think you teed me up beautifully because I think what I'm going to try and do is be the contrarian in the room, which is what Peter asked me to do, and make the case as to why sometimes you don't want to do a challenge study in development. But I've also been given the task by the chair to say I'm the last person keeping you from a break. So I'm going to try and do both. So, whenever we think of controlled challenge studies, we have this thing on the right-hand side of our brain, which basically says, look, it's going to save you money. It's going to de-risk your program. It's going to save you time. And actually, it's a pretty cool thing to do. And that's often a discussion we do have, and it's kind of where we all land. It'll be very interesting data that we're going to get out of the study. And I think we're often faced with the other side of the coin, which says, okay, is there a more efficient way that you could generate the same level of evidence? And that could be either through what we just heard, which is a phase 1/2 study. It could be potentially doing a sort of phase 2 field efficacy study. And I think particularly in the context in where we are today in vaccine development, with the kind of really compressed vaccine development timelines, whether we can just do a phase 1, 2, 3 study, very much like Pfizer have done and shown for COVID. And I think when we think about it, and at least in our organization, we often ask ourselves, why do you want to do it? And I think that's really important to understand from the start. There are two separate questions. One is, what's the scientific question you're going to address? But I think more broadly, why do you actually want to do it? And I think both the speakers beforehand sort of touched a little bit about those kinds of reasons. But I think on the other side of the equation, you have to ask yourself, what's the benefit cost equation here? So what's the strength of evidence you will get from that study, and what's it going to cost you in terms of time, in terms of resources, and in terms of just work and capital? And of course, underlying it, of course, is which I think we're going to get to next, is of course, is what the ethical considerations in doing that kind of study. So here's kind of what a normal, more traditional vaccine development timeline pre-pandemic looks like, no longer post-pandemic. But I want to point out a couple of things here. The first is when you are in the preclinical stage, you are talking a lot about antigen selection issues. You're talking about target identification. You want to make decisions on vaccine formulation and dose. And I think as soon as you get into early development in the phase 1/2, you're asking very similar questions, but you want to answer that in humans. And this particular sort of cycle, you can sort of keep getting stuck in. You want to answer the question in phase 1/2, you go back, you improve your formulation, and you go around. And the question is, could challenge studies do something to sort of break you out of that cycle? I think the second thing, of course, where challenge studies could play a role is we've talked about correlates of protection. I think we've got good data now to sort of speak to that. And lastly, as we just heard, extremely importantly, whether you can have clinical proof of concept. And the reason those things become really important is because you're then going to land up making a huge investment for your phase 3 programs. And that's where you need to decide before you make that investment. Now, again, that depends on your risk appetite. We've seen that very differently today, but that's generally where you want to find some way to de-risk that entire investment. And I think that's sometimes where challenge studies can play a role. But I think beyond that, and I think Andrew, you touched on, is about whether you can use it for indication extension studies. Could you go into a different population? Could you ask for a different outcome in your label? And I think those are some things we should be discussing when we talk about challenge studies as well. But here am I often where you land up having the conversation. So in most cases, you kind of have a pretty good idea of why you want to do a challenge study. But quite often, this is where most of the debate actually happens. What are the considerations you need to take into account when you're thinking about the risks of doing a challenge study? And not in terms of, the participant risk, but really for your programmatic risk. So I think the first thing we often start off with is the strength of evidence. And I think we've talked about, and a lot of people have talked in the past about target populations, statistical inference, how can you design it better, what the endpoints look like, model comparability to natural infection. But I think the bottom line is, based on the results I'm going to get from this study, what inference can I make for my program moving forward? Is it going to be, like Chris, you asked, a go, no go decision or not? And we can talk about some examples of that. I think the other really important one is the motivation, so the product licensure. So is it product licensure? Is it seeking investment? We've heard about the biotech model. We've talked about really whether we can get licensure based on it. And I think the last thing which we're beginning to appreciate more and more is that development doesn't stop at licensure. You really have to get your vaccine deployed. And therefore, evidence generation continues all the way from the start right through to the very end. And some of the places where I think challenge studies can begin to start helping is if you extend the idea of where challenge studies can provide evidence generation beyond just more early development into much more sort of deployment stage. So what additional evidence could you get from a challenge study, which you may or may not be able to generate or by doing other kinds of trials? And then I think what is really important, particularly in organizations, that particularly developing organizations or developers, is the risk appetite. What's the competition look like? What's the landscape, and what does it look like? So if you are a first-in-class vaccine, perhaps like Pfizer were for RSV with older adults, you may not have a very high risk appetite. You may want to de-risk your program. Today, if you were a new company coming in and wanting to make an RSV older adult, you probably wouldn't want to do a challenge study. You probably want to go straight through. You may want to take that risk a little bit higher. And I think those are often the considerations we take into account when we try and make these decisions. The other thing with the risk is, of course, the investment. So are you fast to market? Are you going to try to be best in class? Are you trying to get there as early as possible? And are you willing to spend a lot of money to do that in the context of an efficacy study? Or are you okay with being potentially best in class and you want to de-risk your program, you want to keep improving it and come in over the top? And I think those are also some considerations that need to be taken into account. And then lastly, which nobody ever forgets, is time and cost. We're all sort of subject to that. And one of the things that's very important when we discuss that is, do you have an established model, or are you going to spend the time to build one? And that becomes a really important discussion point. So in places like flu, for example, or RSV, where there may be an established model, you might be willing to have sort of go in more quickly. If you're going to spend the time with a new indication, a new target, to actually develop or co-develop a model, that's going to be a different discussion. And I think that sometimes those things are not well appreciated. So I think you're going to be very familiar with this. I'm not going to spend too long on this question, but the thing I do want to point out is, why can't you do a field efficacy study versus a CHIM? And some of the reasons I'll just speak to here is, one is, of course, safety. And I think that's an important consideration. We're beginning to realize that with the current COVID vaccines, something you may not have picked up in an early trial, but something you could have if you saw the signal. And that's something you may or may not pick up in a small challenge study. The other thing is this question about breadth. And we've heard about clinical outcomes, about whether it's severe disease and mild disease. But sometimes we're beginning to have this discussion a lot more about the breadth of efficacy and the breadth of coverage, particularly in the context of viral pathogens. And that's something which I think challenge studies may or may not address very easily. And that may be a reason why you want to do a field efficacy study. A good example of this is, if you really wanted to make a universal flu vaccine or a broadly protective flu vaccine, what evidence are you going to take to the regulators? Is it going to be against one strain, or may you be better off in a field efficacy study showing you've got protection against multiple strains? And then lastly, of course, we've talked about immunological characterization, where of course the challenge study has clear advantages. There's no doubt about that. But one of the things we often look at is the regulatory evidence. Where are the regulators going to land on the evidence you're going to generate to be able to walk into or sort of make the case for a phase 3 study and then further on? Is that trial, and is the data from your challenge study versus field study going to be part of your label? And that's something that is important, because you are investing to do these kinds of studies. And then lastly, the risk for investment. And we've talked about the financial risk for investment, but there is a credibility risk for investment, and that works in two ways. and perhaps more for biotechs than necessarily big pharma, but it applies to big pharma as well, which is, of course, you don't want to be in a situation where you fail your challenge study. And that, of course, then has multiple implications for your investors, but also for your own program and the likelihood that you may never come back from that challenge study. So that's something that we really discuss a lot. Is it worth doing a challenge study, or you're better off taking the risk and doing something different? So I'm going to end with sort of my summary slide, but I had a few examples, and I seem to have got the wrong deck, Maya. So I'm going to give you two examples before I get into this. So I'm going to talk about one example of, let's take a new influenza vaccine, and we're going to make a new neuraminidase vaccine. And the first challenge study that I know of for a neuraminidase vaccine was in the 1970s. So we've got a few years now where we haven't done anything with it. The question today is, would you repeat that challenge study? Would you do a challenge study for a neuraminidase flu vaccine? And the answer may simply be actually no, because we probably have 50 years of evidence to suggest this is going to work. And therefore, I'm better off just walking straight into a field efficacy study of some sort and getting that result. Conversely, and this is a good example, Helen, of what you were talking about, where I think industry and academia have come together, is pertussis. And pertussis faces a huge problem, which is fundamentally you cannot do an efficacy trial, but we do need next generation pertussis vaccines. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is actually establishing a challenge model and then doing it. In fact, we've worked with colleagues from Southampton here, but of course we've set up a challenge study there through the Periscope program of IMI. But that's a situation in which you can imagine developers actually working to co-develop a model, because the likelihood is that that's really going to be informative and useful when it comes to licensure, and perhaps the only pathway to licensure. And so that kind of equation is very different to the one I just talked about previously. So our major stakeholders often when we're developers are the regulators and then the NITAGs, or the recommending bodies. And I think the default position, I'd be happy for somebody to change this, is that where clinical efficacy can be demonstrated, CHIMs are not going to be enough. And whether that's for licensure, whether that's for post-approval commitments, or for a recommendation. And therefore, it really puts the burden on identifying the right place and the right reason and the right model for doing a challenge study. So I think licensure pathways in scenarios where efficacy cannot be easily demonstrated. We've had, I think, at least one example today about Shigella, a very clear reason for doing a challenge study. And I think that makes life a lot easier in sort of developing and investing in that kind of study. But I think where we may perhaps need to push our regulators and the recommending bodies and overall as a community is, can CHIM study actually provide sufficient data to establish a COP? And what I mean by establish versus saying, these things are important, versus actually doing what we often do in efficacy trials by actually identifying a correlative protection. The other thing clearly is that it's very hard to sort of demonstrate novel mechanisms of action in large efficacy trials. So if you're looking at mucosal immunity, you're looking at T cells, you want to look at very complicated gamma delta T cells, those kinds of things you really, really can't do very easily. And perhaps that's where the CHIM model clearly comes into play. The question is, can we get the regulators to buy in? And I think the question we've asked, I think somebody posed this on this 100-day CEPI idea of making a vaccine. Under what situations would a challenge model suffice for a phase 2b efficacy trial prior to moving into a phase 3 study? And I think that discussion does need to be had. And the only caveat to that, I think, is we're getting to the stage where, we've talked about risk in vaccine development. We're getting a much bigger risk appetite. And therefore, with these adaptive trial designs, perhaps the challenge model does drop out in terms of development. And then lastly, I think the two other things that we should be really carefully thinking about is combination vaccines. We're going to get to the stage where with COVID, we're going to have COVID plus RSV plus flu plus, etc., combination vaccines. Are we going to be doing challenge sort of efficacy trials every time we add a new component? I mean, I don't think so. The answer is no. So at that point, could we use challenge models instead for combination vaccines where you get an indication for the added component based on the challenge model? And then I think the big question is, a very standard licensure pathway for us today is immunogenicity and head-to-head immunogenicity in the context of an established correlative protection. Instead of that, would you be willing to license our product on a head-to-head challenge model? And if we demonstrate superiority or non-inferiority, would that be sufficient to have a claim with, of course, post-marketing commitments? And I think those are some of the issues I think we probably need to develop as a community with the regulators and the recommending bodies as well. So let me end by some cans and cannots and maybe sort of reflections on decision making. So, and I think purposely being fairly provocative, I think CHIMs can clearly de-risk investment. I think that's pretty clear. It can provide correlates of protection. It does provide a very early signal of efficacy. And it does provide sort of potential antigen selection of novel targets, although that's rarely done nowadays. What I think it's not doing is it cannot substitute for regulatory requirements of a field efficacy study today. And I think that's perhaps where the conversation needs to go. But when it comes to decision making for challenge models, I think they're very complex and they're usually multifactorial. And there's never one reason why we do or do not do it. But if I could generalize, I think you have much lower value in situations where speed is very important. I think, Andrew, you touched on that. And if speed is more important than de-risking the investment, you're probably not going to do a challenge study. Where you have value, I think, is if you want to de-risk your investment, but also if you want to benchmark against an established standard of care. So perhaps instead of going in and doing a field efficacy study against, Pfizer's new RSV older adult vaccine, if you did a challenge study, perhaps that's a better indication. And we've got some examples of that with Vaxart, for example, that did their challenge study for flu with you and compared it to a standard of care. I think it has very high value when you look at new antigen identification. We've talked about that a little bit, but I think a good example of that is actually the field of malaria, where I think we've gone multiple cycles using challenge models to, in fact, identify better and better antigens. And often you can sort of stop antigens or stop vaccine development for certain antigens based on challenge models. And then I think novel areas, we talked about that again, I think, Andrew, a little bit about, say, if you went to oral vaccines, mucosal vaccines, those are much harder targets, much harder to sort of get regulatory acceptance for. And perhaps that's where challenge models do help. But I'm going to end, I think, with a question for all of us in the room, which is, what can this group of people do? Because I think if the regulatory and acceptance, and if the recommending body acceptance for challenge studies changed, I think you'd see uptake of challenge models more and more. And I think the question for us is going to be, how do we get to that point? So with that, I think I've hit the time limit. So thank you very much and happy to take any questions.